Alrighty guys, if you want confusing videos, this is going to be the one for you, because it's a response to a response to a response. This one was suggested by Meth Ambassador, so let's go ahead and roll the intro. Alright guys, thank you for stopping by. If you haven't subscribed already, then maybe by about the halfway point you'll decide whether or not you want to. Or you'll leave me a nasty comment in the comment section. That works too. Those of you who've been on the channel before, you know the drill. Fan art and then content. So first off, we have a Rule 63 Suris by Sailor Shadow. Then we have a Cthulhu Suris by Polar Fox Sparkles. Ending on a Rule 63 sketch by Secret Heritage. As always, thank you all for your submissions, and let's get right into the actual context for the video before the video itself. So, a bit of history. There's this channel called The Beat, and The Beat released a video a while back arguing 7 points why slavery was not permitted in the Bible, or at least that it was different and that somehow that matters. Cosmic Skeptic then did a response to him, and then another channel named What Do You Meme did a response to Cosmic Skeptic. I'm going to be responding to What Do You Meme while inserting my commentary on the other points as well. Basically, while the video was made by What Do You Meme, I will be responding to the video itself, so there may be points where I have contentions with what Cosmic Skeptic says, but I'm going to try to focus most of my criticism on What Do You Meme's responses. Anywho, let's go ahead and get ready for the confusing cacophony that is a quad-deep video response.
Does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
So I want to go ahead and start out that there was a bit of a bait and switch here. The question that you brought up yourself, Alex Parr, was does the Bible support slavery? And then you switched us to the question, does it support the kind of slavery that we experienced here in the United States? There are various different types of slavery, some tied to religion and some tied to ethnicity. They are all violations on human rights. It doesn't matter what the context is. So when you do this thing where you say, it's different than the slavery we experienced in the US, my counterpoint is that that doesn't matter. But anyways, continue. I've spent a lot of time arguing on the point in the original video, instead of the point of the video response I'm trying to get to.
This should be our first cause for concern. The video begins by suggesting that we're about to hear an argument that the Bible doesn't support slavery, and yet we're now being readied for, instead of, here is proof, unequivocal proof, that the Bible condemns slavery, rather something more like, well, slavery is supported in the Bible, but it's a special kind of slavery that isn't all that bad. Obviously, this hasn't been explicitly said yet, but I want you to pay attention to the language being used here. Consider this question throughout the video. Are we being offered proof that the Bible does not justify slavery? Or are we being offered an excuse for the fact that it does?
Alright, so to start, giving context and clarifying terms is not the same thing as making excuses.
You're right, giving context and clarifying terms is not the same thing. But when you give that your question that you're going to be answering is does the Bible support slavery, and then you switch to does it support the kind of slavery that we experienced in the US, you'd have to at least acknowledge that a bait and switch has in fact occurred. It's not like a clickbaity title that the video didn't necessarily live up to. That's a thing that happens on YouTube all the time. It's a question proposed within the video itself and then substituted for another one.
We'll see what happens throughout the video, but just note that either Cosmic Skeptic is right and Parr is just making excuses. In that case, then Parr is guilty of acting as if there's a relevant distinction between biblical slavery and non-biblical slavery when there really isn't. Or Parr is given relevant distinctions that are significant and also given context, in which case Cosmic Skeptic would actually be guilty of acting as if there are no relevant distinctions when in actuality there are. So who is the guilty offender here? We'll see.
But before we get into that, let's go ahead and propose that there's a third option, that there are relevant distinctions between the two different types of slavery, but that they are in fact both slavery, and therefore both condemnable. If I'm right that this third option exists, at least as a hypothetical, then What Do You Meme has committed a bit of a black and white fallacy by giving us two opposing ideas that we have to choose between, when other options do in fact exist.
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
Okay, would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind? Perhaps, but it's an important point. God did in fact invent the concept of the ownership of human beings, since he himself has an absolute right and authority over our lives.
Okay, stop right there. Now, right off the bat, we have a pretty bad argument.
I agree that it's a bad argument because Christians don't necessarily believe that God is a slaver, and at the same time, they believe that people willingly enter servitude. And I know this is exactly what you're going to say, but I'm going to go ahead and say how I would phrase this argument myself. If we accept the premise that God is all-knowing, we accept that God knows the consequences of any of his actions. My second premise would be that any of God's actions, by principle of entailment, necessitate that he would be the creator of not only the initial action, but also everything that comes as a result, because as an all-knowing being, he knows what all of the results of his actions will be. Unlike standard human beings within the Christian mythos, God is uniquely privileged with all knowledge. So if God creates humans, and then humans create slavery, we can accept that God did in fact create slavery, because God knew that his actions would directly lead to it. Much in the same way that we would argue that Hitler was responsible for 6 million deaths, even though he himself did not murder people. We understand that the consequences of his actions led to deaths, and we rightly hold him responsible for those deaths. God, likewise, should be held to that standard, if not a higher one, because unlike someone like Adolf Hitler, God knows exactly what any of his actions will lead to. God could have envisioned and created a world in which slavery didn't exist. Nonetheless, he did. Meaning, God is responsible for creating a world where slavery exists, knowing full well that slavery would exist in the world that he created in the way that he created it.
So first off, willful submission is not the same thing as slavery. This seems pretty obvious. I willfully submit to my wife, and I willfully entered into marriage with her, but that doesn't mean that I'm a slave. Now, I've already responded to this argument in the previous video, but let me just add another quick thought here. So let's be clear on his argument here. He states that God is a slave owner because he has a right and authority over mankind. But if you have children like I do, you also have a right and authority over them, but that doesn't mean that you're a slave owner just because you created them.
And now what you're doing is rephrasing Cosmic Skeptic's argument. Cosmic Skeptic never said that God has a right and authority over people. He just argued that God would be the de facto slave owner over people. This right and authority thing is something you're shoehorning in. For instance, there can be mesotheists who in fact believe in your God's existence, but do not believe that he has a right or authority over them at all. But if we look at the definition of a slave, it's any person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. If we accept the Christian mythos that all will bend the knee to God, then yeah, people are slaves to God within the Christian mythos. I'm not saying that it's the best argument. I still prefer the principle of entailment. Slaves are in the unique position of not being able to withdraw from any arrangement where they have been subjected. If Christianity holds true, I cannot withdraw from the arrangement that God has set up where I either go to heaven or hell. I can't simply choose annihilation. I have to accept eternal servitude or eternal torture. If you want to argue that God has this right and keep your shoehorned argument, then all you've done is make excuses for slavery, not actually argue that slavery isn't in fact happening. Again, not the strongest argument, but it is still at least a valid one.
I mean, but okay, I'll play ball. So let's just go ahead and grant that. If you have a right and authority over people, then that makes you a slave owner. But just as my kids can grow up and move out and they can choose to separate from my love, my guidance, and my protection, we can also choose to separate ourselves from God's love, guidance, and protection. That's actually what hell is according to the Bible. And it doesn't even matter what view you hold on hell. All of the views that I know all agree that hell is separation from God.
So wait, it doesn't matter what view you have on hell because all the views that you know on hell are one particular view. So if somebody views hell as eternal conscious torture, that view now suddenly doesn't matter as per your argument. If someone views hell as Sheol, or the grave, as Judaism did, where annihilation is closer to what happens as opposed to eternal conscious torture, even though that would be an argument in your favor, because now God is not responsible for the eternal torture of millions of human beings, that doesn't matter, because all the views that you've heard are not that view. Maybe this was just a slip-up in your script. I'm going to go ahead and apply the principle of charity and say it was a slip-up, and you didn't quite get that that's what that entailed.
So even on his argument, a person can still choose to separate from God if they wish.
This is, of course, not the kind of slavery being discussed in the video, but if anything, this even more undeniable type of slavery propagated in the Bible is even worse than the kind apparent in the slave trade. At least when owned by a human being, there's always a chance of redemption, changes in the law, escaping to freedom, or at the very least death, if it's decided that no life is better than one spent in bondage. This is all possible in something like the slave trade. Not so much with the ownership of human beings by God. There is no escape. There is no chance of a change in the law, there is no appeal, and there is no death. Now, I can already hear you. Alex, don't be such a melodramatic Hitchens impersonator. God isn't a slave owner. Slave owners don't offer their slaves a chance to access paradise, and they certainly don't give them a choice. They chain them up and whip them into forced labor. God gives his subjects a choice. They're able to follow him or not, as they please. We have to be incredibly careful to unpack the euphemistic language of religion, to understand what the real message is behind any teaching. So, what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity.
Okay, so now we've moved on from Christians being slaves because they willfully choose to submit to God, but now we're talking about all of humanity being slaves because they don't have a choice. So to be clear, his argument seems to be that being forced to choose between God and hell is really no choice at all. So this doesn't just make Christians slaves, but it makes all of humanity slaves.
That's actually been the point from the beginning. While I'm not a mind reader and I can't say what Alex actually meant, I think the point from the very beginning was that humanity was under servitude of God, whether they liked it or not. Anywho, continue.
Now, what's wrong with this argument? To be clear, just because God doesn't offer us an alternative choice that Cosmic Skeptic would prefer, doesn't mean that we don't have any choices at all. That doesn't mean that God hasn't given us a choice. It means that God's only given us a choice between two alternatives.
So, if I hold a gun to your head, and I say that you've got a choice between getting shot or bowing down and serving me, that's not a choice. That is what's called an ultimatum. An ultimatum is a final statement or terms and conditions made by one party to another, especially one that expresses a threat of reprisal or war. Let's go ahead and call hell the threat. And if you don't think hell's the threat, I actually have a very old video on my channel talking about this that I will link in the description below. A choice, on the other hand, is an option, a decision, an opportunity to select something. The difference between a choice and an ultimatum is that an ultimatum only has one choice, and then a punishment as an alternative if you don't take it. Whereas an actual choice is a set of options. You can choose to do X or you can choose to do Y. Not you can choose to do X or you can choose to do die. Speaking of terrible puns, based on your channel name, I think I have to actually say I have no mouse, but I must meme.
I mean, let's consider the logic being used here. So we all have to follow the speed limit. Now, if we choose to speed anyway and we get caught, then we have to suffer the consequences for the choice that we made. So we have two options here. We can either do what the lawmakers say and obey the law, or we can choose not to and then suffer the consequences for that choice.
Yes, except now you have to consider why these options were put in place in the beginning. A speed limit is put in place so that the road can be more safe for all drivers. For instance, a speed limit of 35 miles an hour may be put at a place that has several sharp turns, but once you get onto a straight and narrow highway, the speed limit may be increased to about 70 miles an hour. These are actions taken for the safety of the public at large so as to prevent issues from happening. And the consequence of any of these things, being jail time or a fine, is supposed to be a punitive measure that allows you to learn not to do this again. Like when you put your hand on the stove and it burns and you realize, oh, when I do this dumb thing, I suffer this consequence. Hell doesn't operate under these rules. Hell is eternal. It doesn't end. Hell is a punitive action for which there actually is no learning. Once you've entered hell, there is no getting out. You can't just be in hell for thousands of years and then say, oh, I've learned my lesson because I have now spent the equivalent of several lifetimes taking punishments for the inane actions I did during my life. Whereas the concept of serving your time in the prison system can be argued, it is at least much more humane in that it allows people to learn from their actions. Though, again, the degree to which punitive action in this way actually lets people learn, as opposed to focusing on reform, is up for debate. Looking at you, United States penal system, highest rate of repeat offenders, almost as if strictly punitive action doesn't actually lead to better outcomes. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, right, hell. A punitive action that can't actually lead to better outcomes.
Does that mean because I don't like either of these two choices that the speed limit laws are slavery?
No, because slavery isn't something done for your own good. Slavery is something done for the benefit of someone else. However, there is an argument that speed limits like this can be done not just for public safety, but can also be exploited for the benefit of other people. Please see speed traps and quotas. So even your speed limit comparison can actually be attributed to a type of slavery, in that we have no choice in the matter, and the punitive action might not actually be there for anyone's benefit, simply for the financial gain of maintaining the station average. I mean, hell, the Florida Highway Patrol has actually come under fire for allegedly firing an officer for not writing enough tickets in 2009. Welcome to the real world. Shit like this happens.
Is Jesse Smollett innocent? Nope. So if the speed limit laws don't make us slaves, then only having two choices that we don't like do not make us slaves either.
Again, the key word is choices. Heaven and hell are not choices. It's an ultimatum. Once you wrap your head around that, you might start to realize why this argument is so bad.
Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
But to make matters even worse, if there could be such a thing, Cosmic Skeptic does not seem to understand the basic understanding of the gospel in Christianity, and it's not as grim as he tries to make it out to be.
Actually, no, it is that grim. What you're going to do now is attempt to give context as to why it's not that bad, because in the Christian worldview, insert reason here. But the thing is that when you take a step back from that Christian worldview and look at the reality of things, you're left with one thing. God is an abuser. While I both believe that a case can be made for God as a slave owner, and I also believe that it's not the best point, the nature of giving ultimatums to somebody is a move that is usually enacted as an exercise of a disproportionate power dynamic. And when you have an unhealthy power dynamic like that, many actions end up coming off as abusive. I would say that giving ultimatums in general is an abuse of power, especially when the cost of accepting the punishment side of the ultimatum is so astronomically high as the Christian hell is.
In Christianity, here's the real choice. God is giving you two options, one of which is God himself paying for all of the things that you yourself have done wrong, or you can choose to pay the consequences for all the things that you yourself have done wrong yourself. So God's actually offering to pay your debt.
And this, again, is a tactic of abuse. God created the system in which humans would have to pay off their debt. And if we accept the principle of entailment from before, God is directly responsible for that system and all things that happen within that system. God isn't some third party that, out of the graciousness of his love, is paying for the sins of human beings. He's as much responsible, if not more, than any one human being is for the sin that exists in the world. So, trying to paint God as some benevolent benefactor who is so graciously paying for your sin isn't just disingenuous, it paints God as the abusive character that I truly believe that he is, if he does in fact exist. Claiming to take the responsibility for your sins off of your shoulders if you'll just let him pay for it, when he himself was responsible for the sin and situation in the very beginning. It's like offering to bail somebody out of jail after you framed them for a crime. You're not being benevolent, you're just screwing with people's emotions. Again, this is a tactic of abusers.
So if we relate this back to the slave owner analogy, what do we get? On one hand, we have a slave that's much more like a prisoner in today's society. We have somebody that did a lot of things wrong, and he has to pay the consequences for those things that he did wrong. And on the other hand, we have the slave owner who says, hey, let me pay for the things that you did wrong, so that way you don't have to pay for them yourself, and I'll take on the suffering, so that way you don't have to suffer. That's the analogy that's more accurate when we're talking about Christianity.
Except ultimately none of that matters. What you're doing here is trying to delegitimize real slavery that happened in the past by saying that it's not like slavery that your particular ancestors experienced. It's not really much different than trying to delegitimize the stripes that children are dealing with while being put in cages here by saying that those camps are not the same type of camps that Jews had in the Holocaust. Even though by the technical definition of concentration camps, they actually passed the bill perfectly fine. Just as a concentration camp is any camp where members of a national or minority group are confined for reasons of state security, exploitation, or punishment, so too is the slavery depicted in the Bible still slavery, because it is a condition where one human being is being owned by another, being considered by law as property.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
So here's the spot where we have to stop and define some terms real quick so that way we can understand what's meant by the word slave for the remainder of the video. What is the slave? According to our modern dictionary, a slave is a person who's the legal property of another person and is forced to obey them. Now it's pretty obvious what we think of when we hear the word slave today. We all have a mental picture of what we learned growing up in school. As a black man who has ancestors that were kidnapped and brought to America, forced into abusive labor, I can emotionally relate to the connotation that this word has for us today. This is obviously something that I don't take lightweight. So when we think of the word slave, we're usually thinking of people being held against their will and treated as things instead of people. By things, I mean objects that don't have the rights of people, and the owner can do whatever they wish to their things. So in other words, what makes the word slavery so offensive today is that it carries the emotional connotation of people being degraded and oppressed and treated like things instead of people. In our culture, when we hear the word slave, we immediately think of the American slave trade. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that's being translated to slave is abed, which comes from the root word abad, which means to work or to serve. So the word abed directly translates to the words worker or servant. There is no Hebrew word for slave.
Okay, but that ultimately doesn't matter. If they functionally operated like a slave, the mere fact that their language didn't have a word for it doesn't mean that the word doesn't still function in that way. This is, in fact, one of the reasons why the Bible was used to promote slavery so much in the United States itself. But back to the topic at hand. As it is, slavery was a common practice in antiquity. These types of slavery varied from debt slavery, slavery as a punishment for crime, and the enslavement of prisoners of war. If you check in the description, I'll be providing a source on ancient slavery. But the fact of the matter is, just because you don't have a word for something doesn't mean that the action didn't happen. Just as here in the States, I can experience schadenfreude, even though we do not have a word to actually express the emotion of schadenfreude. For those who don't know, schadenfreude is specifically pleasure derived from someone from another person's misfortune. And no, it's not the same as sadism.
The word abed was a neutral word that denotes a relationship based on dependency. So the word was neutral, it wasn't inherently negative, which is why we see the word used in positive ways and also used as a word of honor. But as anybody who's actually really looked deep into this subject realizes that things just aren't as cut and dry as we would like for them to be. In the Old Testament times, we could say that there were about 3 main categories that slaves or servants would fall under. The first, and by far the most common, are servants who are voluntarily working to pay off debt or to acquire land. These are the Hebrew servants or slaves. The next categories are foreigners who are non-Hebrew, but who also voluntarily entered into work for the same reasons. They wanted to pay off debt or acquire land as well.
And in a subtle twist of racism, foreigners had a different set of rules. Whereas Hebrew slaves could work off their debt in a matter of 7 years, foreigners didn't really have any such out.
And we'll get into more of the context about this later on. And then there's the third category of servants or slaves. This is the category where we can just call them the bad guys for now. In this category is where you're going to find those like the prisoner of wars who were captured from other armies.
So, by your logic, anybody that was in slavery because they were a prisoner of war, it's okay because they're the bad guys. And that makes things different. You do understand that whoever the bad guy is really ultimately boils down to a matter of perspective, right? Like, by that logic, simply saying that brown people are the bad guys now justifies slavery of anybody who's brown.
Obviously, things were going to be a little bit different for these people because they were more of a threat. They'd be working harder and they'd be under a tighter watch, but these guys weren't slaves, they were prisoners.
And what is a slave but a prisoner who works? You're really just playing semantic language games here when the functional usage of these words co-align perfectly. As it is, those prisoners of war were still considered slaves. But if you think you know more than the vast amount of historians who have done research on the antiquity of slavery, research that can apparently be debunked by a simple semantic word game, then by all means, please produce a historical paper for peer review to your nearest college and let your peers have a crack at it.
The Hebrew words and the context help us to discern what category of these servants or slaves we're talking about, and also how God instructed for them to be treated during biblical times. The slaves that are mentioned in the main verses that Cosmic Skeptic talking about are best understood as workers or servants. They weren't the bad guys, although he does talk about the bad guys later on towards the end of his video. But overall, the people that he's talking about were working to pay off debt, to acquire land, or looking for a new place to live.
And we're ignoring the fact that there were actually legal loopholes that a master could use to keep their slaves indefinitely, right? Even a slave who happened to be Hebrew, so a slave that only had to be a slave for 7 years, could be kept in servitude indefinitely if they started a family with another slave that the master owned. A slave that could be one of these prisoners of war, or bad guys, or a foreigner who has no such 7-year legal protection as the Hebrews do.
So it wasn't like the slave trade in America. Now, I'm not trying to romanticize this type of slavery. I'm not trying to say that it was always easy or anything like that. But one thing that needs to be clear is that it was voluntary.
Except for the slaves that you've actually completely forgot to mention, the ones that the Hebrews were allowed to purchase from the nations around them. Those aren't the bad guys or the prisoner of war, and those also are not the Hebrew slaves or even foreigners that are trying to acquire land. Those are outright bought slaves. Bought like chattel, bought like slaves during the African-American slave trade. Your entire point can be dismissed even with ignoring that, because up until this point, it's been a semantic game, not actually an argument of substance about the historical context of slavery, simply saying that, oh, well, the rules were a little different and they didn't have a word for it. But when you remember that there actually were slaves that could be bought from the nations around Israel, then you start to realize that there's some very important context that you're leaving out, whilst accusing other people of ignoring context. For context, please look at Leviticus 25:44, where it expressly says that you may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. And there seems to be a category you forgot.
Now, I know that Cosmic Skeptic objects to this, so we're going to go ahead and visit his objections here in a little bit in the video.
God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery.
Okay, stop.
Agreed, I'd like to stop him here as well. We know that God could have envisioned a world in which slavery didn't exist, so this point seems moot. To argue that this is the world that had to exist is to strip God of many of his powers that he otherwise has as an omnipotent being. But anyways.
Yes, the Bible contains laws regulating murder, theft, polygamy, and divorce. But here's an important question. What are these regulations exactly? Well, let's see. The regulations on murder are, don't do it. The regulations on theft are, don't do it. Polygamy, divorce, yeah, don't do it. The laws regulating these things were not regulations, but explicit condemnations. Exodus 20:15, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not steal." This leaves no room for confusion, and I wouldn't dream of arguing that the Bible endorses theft. The only, I'll repeat, the only appropriate regulation on slavery is its abolition. Anything less than this, at the very least, demonstrates that God doesn't feel as strongly about it as he does, say, divorce or adultery. "Thou shalt not claim ownership of other human beings" is nowhere to be found in the pronouncements at Sinai or in any of the books that follow it. Why not?
Okay, so Par here, the other guy that was in the video, was a little sloppy and seemingly implying that all of the things that are regulated are in the same category. But Cosmic Skeptic's basic question still holds. The basic question here seems to be, why did God flat out command things like don't kill, don't steal? But when it comes to slavery, instead of flat out commanding against slavery, he punched regulations around it. Well, the first thing that came to my mind when I considered Cosmic Skeptic's question was that he's still holding on to this faulty assumption as if it wasn't consensual and there was no benefit for both parties involved.
Actually, no, he didn't say that there was no benefit to both parties involved. If you are a slave, even in the United States, so I guess if you were a slave, you did receive benefits. Many times you received housing, you received food, and in some rare cases you could also receive various forms of protection. In fact, in the United States history, this exact point about the mutually beneficial existence of slavery was given for the South. You're literally parroting plantation owners. In fact, if I were to read a quote from the Texas Articles of Secession, "We hold as undeniable truths that the government of various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race has no agency in their establishment, and that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable, that in this free government all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. that the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind, and the revealed will and authority of the Almighty Creator as recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both the disillusion and upon the 15 slave-holding states. So, while the language may be a little different in that it's more overtly racist here than, say, in the Bible, ignoring the fact that you could only buy your slaves from without and from within, and that in and of itself is a racist position, this same tired rhetoric about slavery being mutually beneficial to both bond and free isn't new. You're literally parroting the words of slave owners in the American South. You're parroting their tired justifications for owning people just so you can support your book that supports owning people, not even realizing that in so doing, you are very much owning yourself.
Seems that if he did, then that would explain why it was different than murder and theft. The only person that feels like they got some sort of benefit from murder and theft is the person that's doing the killing or the stealing. What Cosmic Skeptic still seems to have in mind is involuntary forced labor. And as we'll see in a little bit, it was voluntary and there were mutual benefits for both parties. And that's why it makes a lot more sense to regulate it instead of flat out abolishing it.
We had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
You know, I find it really hilariously funny that Alan Parr is arguing that because there is mutual benefit and consensual entering into an agreement, even though that's not exactly always the case, that slavery, as opposed to being abolished, was something that should have been regulated instead. Meanwhile, when it comes to topics like homosexual marriage, which I know is not the point of this video, but as of September 7th, 2015, you did make a video on that. On the topic of homosexual marriage, Alan Parr thinks that it's an abomination and we shouldn't have it. And don't worry, if you want context, I'll go ahead and make sure that that's my next video. Since it's really weird to me that when it's slavery, you have to jump through every single hoop possible in order to justify it just because your Bible says it's okay. But when it's homosexuality and homosexual marriage, even though it fits every criteria you have set up in your tired ass apologetic, that action arbitrarily cannot be condoned, but the owning of people can. You do realize how nightmarishly and unfathomably stupid this sounds, right? People loving each other isn't okay, but slavery is? Gee, I wonder what kind of God you have to support that would make any arbitrary distinctions like that, where slavery's all right, but when it comes to actual, love and affection, that's bad.
Ensure the proper treatment of slaves. Again, I'll press this. The only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this. There were no laws making sure that the victims of theft were properly treated. People were simply told not to do it. Proper treatment of slaves is a contradiction in terms.
Okay, just as we discussed before, the only reason that he sees a contradiction between slavery and the proper treatment of slaves is because he's still presupposing a view of slavery that was like the slavery that we found during the American slave trade.
No, he's analyzing slavery as it exists in the Bible, as you are able to buy the slaves from around you, as you are able to beat them with an iron rod as long as they survive it after a couple days. That view of oppressive slavery is what he's looking at. He hasn't mentioned the American slave trade. You have mentioned the American slave trade. But so far in the footage that you've showcased, Alex hasn't done that.
But he hasn't demonstrated this assumption yet, he's only assumed it. But as we'll see later, he actually concedes that there is some truth to the fact that some slavery was voluntary, but we'll get to that later. But if I can, may I throw in a little bit of a side note here? Cosmic Skeptic is a moral subjectivist. He made a video a while back about how morality is just an opinion, and he also had a debate on this with my friend Michael from Inspiring Philosophy. In the debate, Cosmic Skeptic argues that there isn't anything that's objectively right and wrong. By the way, objective here means morality that's true for everyone, and morality that everyone is bounded to. So when he seems to insist that there's only one proper treatment of slaves, and that everybody ought to follow it, even God apparently, then he's instantly discredited his own views inside of his own worldview.
And it was at that moment that I realized I could could basically dismiss anything else you said in the video, because your aside is being used to dismiss anything Alex says in his video. Because your objection to somebody saying slavery is wrong is that morality is subjective, you're ignoring the very easy and obvious solution to this problem, just so you can get in a quick gotcha. Even if morality is ultimately subjective, as nonsensical as that phrase is, that would mean that we have to weigh in the morality of the slave and the morality of the slave owner. Because while the slave owner's subjective morality would argue that they should be able to hold their slave, the slave would then argue that their subjective morality says that it's immoral for them to be held. And thus, as a society, we have to come to an agreement about what we will do so that everybody knows what to follow, creating laws in order to protect people, thereby establishing an objective marker for people to work with. You can have objective frameworks within subjective morality. Even divine command theory is considered in philosophical writings to be ethical subjectivism, because it is based on the whims and the mind of a god, subjective to that entity and objective on the way cascading down. Much like how people can have their individual moral subjective structures, but we all have to end up abiding by a series of laws that were imposed on us, and many times not by us. Alex can argue that morality as an abstract concept is subjective, and while I may disagree with him on that, that still allows for objective moral frameworks to exist within that people have to follow, especially where it's pragmatic to keep a functional society. This happens way too terribly often, where a Christian says something about morality, and then an atheist says something about morality, and then the Christian just goes, well, you think morality is subjective, so your opinion doesn't matter, discrediting any part of the argument that could possibly be had. It's happened to me, and it's happened to hundreds of people who I've met. At the end of the day, if somebody's just trying to simply argue that slavery itself is immoral or bad, simply undermining them on their individual views of morality, fact of the matter is, Cosmic Skeptic can at the very least support the argument that you shouldn't have slaves through a subjective lens. Again, I don't agree with Cosmic Skeptic on everything, but I don't have to. Just like you don't have to bend over backwards to justify slavery. And yet, here you are, for some reason. Anywho, I know there's about 5 minutes of the video that I haven't gotten into. If you guys want to check out the entire video, links will be in the description as per usual, but this one's already getting fairly long. In any case, I hope you guys enjoyed, and the next video should be on Alan Parr. Again, I'd like to thank M the Ambassador for suggesting the video, and if you enjoyed it, why not leave a like and possibly share it with your friends. Elsewise, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. As always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.